Better Call Saul is, for all intents and purposes, one of the best shows I've seen on television for the better part of a decade. Or should I say streaming services? It's 2022, come on guys. Really, even when I compare it to its counterpart Breaking Bad, and even though Saul wasn't really even my favorite character when it comes to the Breaking Bad universe, that spot's reserved for Jesse, am I right? Something about all these emotional moments, tense scenes, and compelling characters is told in such a way that had me thinking about the final episode long after I had already seen it. In fact, I'm writing this script at 2 a.m. in the morning, having just watched the final episode, and I have all these thoughts in my head that I'm trying to get down on paper before I forget them, just because I want to talk about how much I appreciate this story from beginning to end. Now, I could talk about every single scene and every single moment within this story that has these masterfully crafted symbolisms within almost every episode that you wouldn't really catch the first time around. Or how the cinematography and the way each scene is shot always has some serious forethought behind it. Or how the music within this series always matches the mood so perfectly. But you already knew this show was a masterpiece. With this video, I just want to talk about what I took away from this series and why the ending is so impactful and has left me thinking about how the end of Saul's story relates to my own life, and how the ending that was shown was literally the only way it could have ended, and I couldn't have come up with a better ending if I tried for years on end. With that said, there are very obvious spoilers ahead for both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, so if you have not completely watched through both of them, this video is not for you. Not yet, anyway. Without further ado, let's get right into Better Call Saul, the final verdict. Better Call Saul from its very first episode was something special. Not just because it's related to Breaking Bad, which is a great show in its own right, but because it's something I think all of us who have siblings, especially brothers, can relate to on a personal level. For pretty much the first half of the series, a huge part of the show is solely focused on Jimmy and Chuck, and the relationship between these two brothers, which, holy hell, is one complicated-ass relationship. It's so easy to look at these two characters and just go, bah, Chuck hated Jimmy, Jimmy hated Chuck, and not bother to look at it any deeper than that. But the reality is that it is that much deeper. Chuck loves Jimmy. Jimmy loves Chuck. You can at least clearly somewhat see that in the beginning of the show. But the further the show goes along and the more Jimmy slips into becoming Saul Goodman, the worse their relationship gets, with Chuck's condition being a perfect metaphor for the situation, with him killing himself after telling Jimmy that he never really cared about him from the very beginning. And from that point on, you wonder if Jimmy really actually cares about the fact that his brother is dead. Jimmy, the brother that would go above and beyond for Chuck, get him what he needed personally from the store every day, is sitting there nonchalantly making orange juice just days after his brother's death. Hell, he reads that letter from Chuck that's his final farewell that makes Kim break down into tears without a shred of emotion on his face, and even uses Chuck's death as an emotional stepping stone just to get his license back. Did Chuck ever actually love Jimmy? Did Jimmy actually care about Chuck's death? Can Jimmy just not help himself and is doomed to be Saul Goodman? I think the answer is clear from Chuck's side of things, since we, the audience, know what caused Chuck to end up regressing to the point where he felt he had to kill himself. But from Jimmy's point of view, he doesn't know that their final conversation is what drove Chuck to the edge, and honestly, it's really sad, because he thinks Chuck pouring his heart out to him in his final farewell letter is just for show, because he thinks he knows how Chuck truly felt about him, when in reality he doesn't have the slightest clue. And all of this contributes to Jimmy's slip and fall into Saul Goodman. And therefore, the audience really wants Jimmy to know and finally realize, hey, Chuck did care about you. Which is why that scene in the courtroom in the final episode is so damn impactful. And I think the courtroom is the only place where these questions could have been answered. Saul, at this point in the courtroom, turns everything he's ever done or known on its head. For once in his life, instead of using the law for his own gain, he acknowledges and respects what the law represents, and adopts the mantle of McGill once more, showing that beneath it all, Jimmy McGill is like his brother before him. It just took him a while to get there.
The name's McGill. I'm James McGill.
I've seen a lot of people exclaim that the only reason Jimmy did this was because Kim was in the courtroom and that it was all a show for her. And while I think Saul was doing what Saul Goodman does best, putting on a show in the courtroom, I don't necessarily think that show was exclusively for Kim. I do think that Kim being there does play a significant role, as he's constantly looking at her throughout the scene. I believe that Jimmy walked into that courtroom with the intention of confessing. See, Kim was different from Jimmy. After that phone call in Nebraska, she realizes that she is running away just like Jimmy has been. She tells him to turn himself in, and Jimmy understandably responds that she's just as guilty as he is. And so she goes and fesses up to everything the two did together. She tells Howard's wife everything and is willing to suffer the consequences of her actions, while Saul goes on a scamming spree. When Jimmy hears about what Kim did, it breaks something in him. Make no mistake, that moment in the courtroom isn't just for Kim. It's for himself, Kim, and Chuck all at the same time. And in that same moment, you realize that Jimmy really does care about the law, just as much as Kim and Chuck, even if he had been pretending not to for the past couple of years. Sure, Saul Goodman used the law for his own benefit for years and years on end, which was the whole reason Chuck had a problem with Jimmy to begin with. But when we look at Jimmy McGill's relationship with the law, we realize that there is a part of him that wanted to do good with the law and make his brother proud. Hell, even people around Jimmy acknowledge that elder law is such an underrated practice and that they appreciate the hell out of him doing it. But around every corner, you see Jimmy slighted by the people around him. Chuck, who went behind Jimmy's back to make sure Howard wouldn't hire him at HHM, his own brother. Kim, who refused to join law practices with Jimmy and only joined him on the condition that they would keep their practices separate, and who later contributes to Jimmy's downfall into Saul Goodman.
Kim, you're shitting me, right?
At the end of the day, it's Jimmy's fault for all these things that happened to him in the end. But if he had, at a minimum, a brother who was supportive of his endeavors and looked out for him without slighting him at every turn, then maybe he wouldn't have turned into Saul Goodman. It's funny in a way. Chuck trying to stop Jimmy from being involved with the law just turns Jimmy into the very person Chuck didn't want Jimmy to become. One scene in the final episode I find particularly interesting, though, is the final scene with Chuck and Jimmy, where Jimmy just got back on another run from the store for Chuck, and Chuck exclaiming that he doesn't have to do this for him every time. You can clearly see that Chuck appreciates Jimmy doing this for him, and you can see that Jimmy doesn't mind because, obviously, they're brothers. But one thing I noticed about this scene, especially considering that it's directly after that scene in the courtroom where Jimmy expresses regret for not trying to be closer with Chuck, is that Chuck keeps inviting Jimmy to sit down and talk with him, and Jimmy keeps shooting him down, saying that he's too busy with clients. What the hell are we gonna talk about? You and me don't really need to talk about anything. And to me, maybe this is one of those times Jimmy was thinking about when confessing in that courtroom. Maybe he should have tried harder, and maybe it wasn't all Chuck's fault.
If you don't like where you're heading, there's no shame in going back and changing your path.
But at least in the end, he finally took Chuck's advice in one regard. He finally decided to change his path. And one other thing I wanted to add on to this scene. When I had listened back to Jimmy and Chuck's final conversation, it's one about regrets. Whereas Chuck tells Jimmy in their final talk, don't have regrets because you just can't help yourself. Embrace your bad side and stop acting like you're a good person, which is exactly what Jimmy ends up doing. But the conversation that takes place in the final episode is the complete opposite of that. The message there feels more so in line with Chuck's true feelings. If you do have regrets and you don't like the way things are going, then you can always change your path. Maybe deep down, Chuck knew that Jimmy would be able to change for the better. It was just going to have to be on his own time. I guess the last thing I want to talk about is that final scene of Kim and Jimmy smoking in the prison. I love that it's a callback to all the times they've done it up to this point, but I more so love the song that plays during this scene. If you remember, the song that usually plays during this scene is titled Shared Smoke, a moment of respite where both characters can relax and reflect on all that they've been through together, both in the past and current day. But in the final scene, the music that plays is titled Shared Sentence, and it's a lot more somber than Shared Smoke is. Sure, Jimmy's the one that's in the prison, but Kim is serving a different kind of time in my book. Her time as a lawyer is all but over, and her free time is spent at a volunteer job doing the exact same type of work Howard would have her do as punishment. Doc review. It's a fitting end for both of these characters, finally having to face the music after everything they had done throughout the series. Even Mike had already paid the ultimate price by the time Jimmy was sentenced. All in all, this show means a lot to me, especially because I consider myself to be the Slippin' Jimmy of the family. Even if you don't have a sibling, I think there's a lesson to be learned from Better Call Saul. And I think that lesson is, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, it's never too late to go down a different path, one that you can be proud of. And with that, that marks the end of this review/weird analysis of Better Call Saul. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed, please make sure to like and subscribe, and support me over on Patreon. I would really appreciate it. Or you better call Saul.